The Sentinel appeared in a cold metal corridor. He looked out to the nearest window to see nothing but empty space. A smile spread across his face. He laughed and made his way down the hall. When the Sentinel came to the cockpit of the Riptide, he was surprised to see a familiar face standing near Vax. Foxtrot. Vax excitedly turned her head at the sound of the Sentinel's voice. You made it! She ran up to him and hugged him. So this is the guy you were talking about? Foxtrot stared at the Sentinel, cautiously. He can help? So, do you remember Foxtrot? Vax asked. Back when I was in my first incarnation, and you in your second, we met him with the astronaut. Me, in my current... that's just confusing things. You remember him though, right? Vaguely. The Sentinel squinted. Okay, well he has no idea. He's only just meeting me, for the most part. Time travel, am I right? Vax laughed. He said something about needing help? The Sentinel sat down on a nearby cargo crate. Foxtrot is just a name I've given myself, Foxtrot specified. I'm the last clone. Clone ID 1AFTR. From the Andromedan's army of clones of Conchna, from which I understand is a clone of you? Past me, yes. The Sentinel held his fist to his chin. Recently, Conchna killed one of my friends, another clone, in response to us trying to figure out what happened to the clones. Okay. The Sentinel was growing more curious with the more he said. But it's not only him. Conchna and his king, the Sentinel leaned in, listening closer, have just wiped out the entire clone army. Themselves. Foxtrot looked at the Sentinel with worry in his eyes, desperate for help. What? Why? When is this? When have I traveled to? 3053, and I don't know why. He glanced at Vax, then back at the Sentinel. My best guess is that maybe they're working on some sort of weapon, something that could outclass the clone army. Or maybe they've just realized it was useless against the Sentinel, Vax suggested. You said that with dead clones they repurposed them into robotic, what'd you call them? Score lions. Both the Sentinel and Foxtrot responded. But it wouldn't be as simple as that, Foxtrot continued. Look, Sentinel, Conchna wasn't making an army to outnumber, despite what he might have you believe. I thought so. The Sentinel stood up. He's trying to overthrow Rogar, isn't he? He believes that you and Rogar are equals, both massive sources of destructive power. He sees no difference in the two of you, protectors of their kind. The power of plasma doesn't belong with either of you, he says. It belongs with the Andromedans. Foxtrot looked down at the floor. With each clone, there's a new mutation. He pointed at his paper white hair. I think he was hoping to find a chosen one, a clone with the power of plasma. My best guess is that he found it.
Care for a drink, sir?
A small robot rolled up next to the Sentinel. It tilted its head and blinked its eyes on a small screen, wiggling its mustache as well. It was some sort of servant bot. Not now, Hermie. Vax shooed away the robot. She looked up at the Sentinel. Can you help us? The Sentinel nodded before fully answering. Yes. Vax smiled and turned around to sit in her pilot seat. Foxtrot sat next to her in the co-pilot seat, and Vax gestured towards some buttons for him to press. She held her hand over a lever and turned around. You might want to take a seat. The Sentinel quickly sat down before she pushed forward on the lever. The stars around them began to stretch, and boom, the ship was off at near the speed of light. The box flew against the wall with the force of the acceleration. A few seconds later, the ship slowed, and stars began to reappear, and they stopped. In front of them lay the largest planet the Sentinel had ever laid eyes on. Its gaseous blue exterior was surrounded by two intersecting green turquoise rings reminiscent of Saturn's. In the distance, barely visible near the edge of a ring, orbited a small green and blue planet. That's Andrometron, the Sentinel pointed at the small planet. And that's Ilsos. Foxtrot gestured toward the massive gas giant. The Sentinel lowered his hand and admired the massive planet that took up most of the cockpit's view, and only some bits of space could be seen. How could a planet get so huge? We're stopping here first. Foxtrot flicked a few small switches and pressed some buttons, followed by a quick typing into a keyboard. Vax lifted up her hand and pulled down on a ceiling lever. How long has it been? The Sentinel asked a question that was nagging in the back of his mind. For you, anyway, since I dropped you off at the CSA building. He stood up, preparing to land. 17 years. Vax stood up and walked past the Sentinel. The ship landed, but the Sentinel couldn't make out where they were. Everything still looked like empty space outside. How have you been? Vax smiled. Better than ever. It's good to see you again, Sentinel. The Sentinel nodded. Where are we? The Sentinel made his way to the door. Asteroid Clone Production Facility 1A of the second ring of Ilsos. This is one of the many clone facilities Conchna destroyed. The one I came from. Foxtrot picked up an Andromedan rifle from the weapons rack and stepped outside. To give you perspective on exactly how many clones he made and then killed, 1A is a facility of 100 of its kind. 2A and 3A all the way to 100A. And then there's 1B, 2B, 4E, 72J, 84Z. Almost an entire ring of Ilsos, every asteroid dedicated to a facility. Each facility dedicated to making thousands of squadrons. 1A alone was responsible for 1AG, 1AR, and my squadron, 1AF. Each squadron with over 600 clones. He wiped them all out. Hundreds of millions of us. Right. The Sentinel followed after him. A silence followed, while the Sentinel was letting the idea sink in, but he chose to ignore it. So how does this work? A facility built on an asteroid? Artificial gravity, or what? The Sentinel admired the construction, or what was left of it, on the asteroid. Yeah. Foxtrot led the way, into a lab near the landing pad. Why are we here? The Sentinel looked around anxiously. It was dark. Very few of the artificial lights were still functioning. The dark purple and blue undertones set him off. To look for clues, Vax reminded him. Wouldn't it be better if we just confronted Concha about this? No one answered him. They kept walking. Something wasn't right. After a bit of wandering, something caught the Sentinel's attention, dripping from the holes in the ceiling. Rain? He looked up. Isn't this an asteroid? Artificial gravity indicator. Basically just an easy way to tell if the gravity setting is set correctly. Foxtrot made his way to a door. Sounds dumb, the Sentinel remarked. Foxtrot couldn't open the door. He tried wedging his gun in to open it with no luck. Whatever damage had been done to the facility had wedged the door in place. Move for a second? Vax warned Foxtrot. She snapped her fingers after he moved, and a plasma explosion blew the door right off its hinges. Well, that works. Foxtrot made his way in. Show off. The Sentinel walked in after him. Learn from the best. Vax walked in last, with a smirk. The room was a mess. It looked like someone had evacuated in a hurry before the clones were wiped out. Foxtrot dug around in the piles of papers, through the cabinets, trashing the place even more than it already was. He looked at one particular paper and whispered to himself, The Chosen Three. Vax helped look around too, less aggressively. Foxtrot scanned over more documents and kept whispering to himself whenever something caught his attention. Clone suppressor helmets? Project Ray? The Sentinel stayed back by the door. He heard a crack of lightning. Lightning? You can't tell me that's for gravity detection too. It's not. Foxtrot looked up at the Sentinel, worried. It's an alarm. The Sentinel felt a strange presence, and he seemed lighter for a split second. His feet slowly lifted from the ground. What's going on here? Vax watched as some of the papers began to float. The Sentinel looked outside and held out his hand, palm side up. The rain was suspended in air, and after a short while, droplets began to fall onto the top of his hand. It's raining upside down. The Sentinel turned around. Someone's here. The three of them floated upwards, and with another crack of lightning, they fell onto the ceiling. Foxtrot stood up and withdrew his rifle. He pressed a button and split the rifle into two pistols. He ran for the door. Where do you think you're going? You'll run out into space! Vax scolded him. The Sentinel held his hand over the doorway. Move. Foxtrot pushed his arm away and jumped out of the doorway. He landed on the ceiling of the corridor and ran. Vax looked at him, leaning her head forward and putting out her hands, asking what they should do without words. The Sentinel shrugged and jumped over the doorway into the corridor. Vax struggled and ran after him. Foxtrot stepped at the end of the destroyed corridor and looked out into the deep, empty space below, then upwards toward the ground. The whole outside area was covered lightly with sprawling, spiderweb-like lighting fixtures. Metal bars and pillars held all the lights up across the whole facility. He looked forward, to the open-air hangar. In it stood a figure, somehow still standing on what was once level ground. Without any further thought, Foxtrot jumped off the corridor's edge. Foxtrot! The Sentinel leaned over the edge. Foxtrot had landed on one of the lighting fixtures. He ran down the web of disfigured, half-melted metal, making his way quickly to the hangar bay. The Sentinel jumped down after him. Vax followed shortly after. When they got closer, they recognized who the figure was. Concha! Foxtrot kept running, faster now. The Sentinel stopped, squinted, and looked closer. Foxtrot, wait! He stopped, crouched, and held onto the bar beneath him. Vax, get down! In an instant, Foxtrot stopped in his tracks. Concha had been controlling the gravity, and he was still in control. The rain stopped in midair again. Foxtrot began to float away, and desperately reached out for the bars beneath him. Concha pulled down on the lever so aggressively that the next transition of gravity was near instant. The rain began to fall sideways, toward the hangar nearly 200 feet from them. The Sentinel held on tight to the bars. Vax fell, and the Sentinel caught her in his arm. Foxtrot began to fall, and the Sentinel had to make a quick decision. He let go of Vax, and she grabbed onto a bar. The Sentinel swung his arm, and a plasma lasso extended and wrapped itself around Foxtrot's leg. Ah! Foxtrot yelled. The pull of the lasso and the speed of his fall broke his ankle. He was dangling mere feet from Concha now, who seemed unaffected by the changes in gravity. Why? Foxtrot winced. He looked up at Concha. Why bring us into this world just to take us out the next second? I have no use for this army, and their existence was pain. Concha held onto the controls of the gravity machine tightly. I was doing the right thing. Is that what Rogar told you? Or the king? Foxtrot spit in his face. You killed my friend. Befriending your brothers was your first mistake. Conchna wiped away the spit. I see you joined forces with the Sentinel. Conchna pressed a button on the gravity machine. Its pull strengthened, applying more stress to the lasso, Foxtrot's ankle, and the Sentinel's hold. If you think I'm evil for wiping out an army that didn't ask to exist, why join the side of a man who killed his own planet? Conchna turned a dial, and the gravity strengthened even more. I can't hold it anymore, the Sentinel strained, pulling with his one arm at the lasso. He held onto the lighting fixture with a slipping grip. Vax stared at Conchna. They couldn't hear what he and Foxtrot were talking about. She held her hand to her head, holding onto the bars with the other. Plasma creeped up the machine. She snapped her finger, and the machine broke. The explosion interfered with Conchna's boots, and he was affected by the change in gravity. Without a functioning gravity machine, the four of them floated freely. The Sentinel let go, and the lasso dissipated. When Foxtrot realized what was happening, he adjusted himself into an upright position relative to Conchna. He punched him in the face. The Sentinel used small bursts of plasma to push himself toward Conchna and Foxtrot. Sentinel, you go after him. I'm gonna go get the ship. Vax turned around, back towards where they landed, and she too used plasma to propel herself. Conchna and Foxtrot were locked in battle, floating up into space. The Sentinel launched himself and grabbed Conchna's ankle. His hands lit aflame, and he burned through Conchna's suit. Now the Sentinel and Conchna were fighting, and Foxtrot was floating off. The Sentinel kicked Conchna in the chest, pushing him into the ground. He took off his coat and flicked his sleeve toward Foxtrot. Foxtrot used the coat to pull himself to the Sentinel. When he arrived, he and the Sentinel propelled themselves to the ground. The coat floated off into space. They used small indents in the ground left over from the facility's destruction to hold themselves down. The Sentinel held Conchna down by his shoulder, burning him the longer he held on. Foxtrot punched him in the face repeatedly. Conchna kicked Foxtrot, launching him into space, and he floated off. He kicked the Sentinel, but his grip was too strong, and he stayed. The power of the kick sent something else flying, however. The Rev Stone from the Sentinel's pocket began to float off into space. He let go of the ground and floated after it. Conchna's eyes grew wide, and he followed after it as well. The Sentinel stretched out his arm as far as he could, reaching for the stone. It was just barely out of his reach. Plasma crawled from his hand like a shadowy extension of his grasp and wrapped around the stone, bringing it into the Sentinel's hands. The stone glowed bright. He cupped it in his hands, turned around, and kicked Conchna in the face. He held out the glowing stone, and a ray of light beamed to the ground below. The ray expanded on the floor, and a small wormhole-like entity appeared. Conchna fell into it, and it closed itself. The Sentinel turned around to look at Foxtrot, who was floating off slightly above him. "Did you see that?" The Sentinel smiled. "What was that?" Foxtrot yelled. "No clue," the Sentinel laughed. Vax's ship approached, upside down, toward the two of them. A hatch on the top of the ship was open, and both Foxtrot and the Sentinel floated into it. When the hatch closed, and the ship's gravity was turned on, they both fell to the floor. "Ah, careful! Maybe a little warning next time?" Foxtrot held his ankle, wincing when he rubbed it. He tried to make it feel better. "Sorry about your foot," the Sentinel apologized. "Didn't mean to do that." "It's no problem, really. I mean, I'd be dead if you didn't do what you did." Foxtrot tried to stand, but he fell back down. "Hold on, let me try something." The Sentinel held his hand to Foxtrot's wound, and his other hand held the Rev Stone over the wound. "You aren't going to amputate my foot with a wormhole, are you?" Foxtrot laughed, joking, but also hoping he wasn't right. "No, it's just... I looked into more about these stones recently. I didn't think the myths about them were true." "What myths?" Foxtrot asked. "No one should have control over these." The Sentinel's hands began to glow, and Foxtrot's wound did too. He could feel it healing. The Sentinel drew back his hand, and there was a sharp pain in his wrist. Foxtrot stood up, fine as ever. "What was that?" He shook his foot. "You healed me?" "Using the Rev Stone I could heal you, while damaging me." The Sentinel shook his wrist. "Just pain, not an injury, but still." He stared at the Rev Stone. "Too much power." "Healing, wormhole creation, what's next?" Foxtrot joked. "Preservation of a being's essence?" The Sentinel stuffed the stone into his pocket. "What?" Foxtrot asked. "So, Sentinel," Vax interrupted. "I think we've gotten the help we needed for now." She gestured toward the Sentinel's box. "You should get some rest. I know how you are. Where are you headed now?" The Sentinel grabbed the box from the air. "About to drop Foxtrot off at the CSA, help him fully join our side. He'll be training there while this beauty of a ship is sent off on its maiden voyage around a black hole. It'll be the first ever." The Sentinel smiled, holding his hand over Matrona's Rev Stone in his pocket. "Sounds cool." He glanced down. "Well, I should be going. Until next time, I guess." He flashed away.